Chapter 196, Snow Solstice. She was met with a long silence. Although Siewei's face was pale, he sat on the dark mountain rock, but his body was slightly tense, and his calm posture was like a fierce beast ready to attack, and his sharp gaze was almost like a sword falling towards her. Jiang Xuning didn't take it seriously. She waited for a long time, and saw that although Siewei's face was extremely ugly, he slowly clenched the bow and arrow in his other hand, and he didn't really mean to make a move. So there was a snort. I forgave him that he could not do such a thing, and did not bother to pay attention to him, so he walked straight into the forest beside the stream, leaving only the words, "I'll go find something to eat." It's a strange thing. In the previous life, she was desperate, and made a special trip to carry soup at night, and recommended a pillow to the master who sat in the Ming Hall, but people smiled at her like smoke and dust, and asked her to respect herself. Jiang Xuning had a thought in her heart. What a bullshit thing. In this reckless mountain wilderness, although it is inaccessible, it is not impossible to find food. When she was young on the Grange, she loved to play around. What can be eaten and what cannot be eaten, there is also some number in my heart. I followed the stream upstream, but I didn't dare to go too deep, but I only searched for the edge of the mountain forest, and I was lucky enough to find a few berries that I could eat and pick on tiptoe. She took a bite and kept the rest in her arms. Although the time of this trip was not long, but it was not short, when I came back, I saw a hare that had been skinned and dirt on the rock, and there was a faint smell of blood by the mountain stream flowing below. Siewei's bow and arrow were put aside, and the blood on one of the arrows was not wiped dry. Apparently it was pulled from the unlucky hare not long ago. He himself sat casually by the newly lit fire, a short knife in his hand, unhurriedly cutting off the branches and leaves that grew on a hard bamboo knuckle. The dagger. Jiang Xuning hadn't seen it all the way. But a long time ago, she had seen it before, and even used it. Walking over, she put down the berries in her arms, she glanced at the rabbit that had been peeled, and secretly twisted her eyebrows, but she didn't say anything, just sat down next to the fire, picked up the berries she had gnawed before and said, "Sir, this knife will not be changed for several years." Siewei didn't speak, cut the bamboo, and then took the hare and put it on. Jiang Xuning looked away. Aren't you more comfortable being a cook than tossing around in the court? Siewei glanced at her, but still didn't answer. Jiang Xuning stopped talking. At this time, the day had already dawned, and the two of them had escaped for the rest of the night, and they were already exhausted and hungry, so they sat silently by the fire, looking at the rabbit that was gradually licked by the tongue of fire. Everything seemed quiet. It's as if the dark tide and Furtat confrontation of not long ago had never happened at all. They all know. In the barren mountains and ridges, people are like wild beasts. Here, there is neither the second girl Jiang nor the young master Siewei. No one is nobler than anyone in the face of life and death, and no one has to be afraid of anyone. Even if there are thousands of troops and horses in hand, the Jinshan Yinhai family is now just single-handed, living alone. Even those hatreds, loves, and resentments are like the fog of this early morning, and they are scattered to the sky. When she took a rabbit leg that Siewei handed over, Jiang Xuning was still polite and thanked her. There is no oil, salt, sauce, and vinegar in the barren mountains. But Siewei's rabbit is roasted crispy on the outside and tender on the inside. The heat is excellent, the golden surface is covered with a layer of oil. Tear off a piece to eat into the mouth, and feel that the meat quality is good, and you can faintly taste the pinewood fragrance scent when the pine branches are burning below. She almost didn't eat her fingers. Although it is indeed difficult to compare with the time of seasoning, it can be regarded as the best taste in the world at this time and place, under this situation. Over the years, Siewei can be regarded as an important minister of the court. As the saying goes, A gentleman is far away from cooking, but this person's craftsmanship has not fallen? After Jiang Xuning was half full, she couldn't help but look at him. Xie Wei had already stepped on the fire and swept it into the stream along with the traces of the fire, and got up indifferently and said, "Let's leave when I'm done." Jiang Xuning saw that he tied the short knife back to his wrist, picked up the bow and arrow again, wiped it clean and put it back into the quiver along with the arrow that had hit the hair before. It's just that the blood hole on the knuckle of the index finger is still a little conspicuous. She was so afraid that this man would die on the road. So he said, "Are your wounds really okay?" Xie Wei said, "If you don't add to the chaos, it's time to heal now." Jiang Xuning. She was really choked and smiled, "I thought my husband was stunned." Xie Wei looked back, "Just sit down and recuperate." After speaking, he said, "If you can distinguish what is fainting and what is resting, maybe the medical skills of the three-legged cat can reduce the harm of a few people." Well, it's all her fault. I don't know why. Jiang Xuning looked at his tepid appearance and was very irritable. After enduring it for a while, he suppressed the urge to lift the bar with him, picked up the uneaten berries on the ground, and followed him forward. The two of them waded across the mountain stream and entered the mountain forest on the other side. The days of rushing are really boring. As the old saying goes, Wangshan can run a dead horse. Xie Wei said earlier that it would be good to walk through this mountain and get to Jinan Mansion. But this piece of mountain wilderness is not very far away when you see it, but you can't see your head for 3 or 5 days when you walk. Although Jiang Xuning didn't have a pampered temper at this time, this body couldn't endure hardships in the end. By the 3rd day, the soles of his feet had been blistered. Even if she doesn't want to drag people down, it's hard to go fast. On this day, they were going to climb over the ridge of a mountain. The mountain is quite steep. After she took a few steps, she was in a cold sweat, and her feet were weak. If it weren't for Xie Wei holding her by the hand, I was afraid that she would have fallen. Jiang Xuning couldn't help but smile bitterly, looked at the sky, hid her deep worry, and said to Xie Wei, "The border pass is waiting for you to go over and preside over the overall situation. Her Royal Highness the eldest princess is in danger. I'm just a piece of waste, it's hard to walk this way, and you're only afraid that it will make matters worse if you take me. It's better for you to leave me here, go to Jinan Mansion first, I'll be in the mountains, and I won't walk around, you can take care of things and send someone to find me." Xie Wei didn't say a word, only tugged the hem of his clothes. There was a hiss sound. He actually tore off one of the snow-white Taoist robes that had been stained with a little dirt, tied it directly to Jiang Xuning's hand, and then tied the other end tightly to his wrist. His face was as heavy as water, and said, "Let's go." Jiang Xuning felt that this person was sick. Obviously, what she proposed was the best thing to do. But Xie Wei didn't think about it or pay attention to what she meant, grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. However, what they were most afraid of still happened. The moment they struggled to climb the ridge, the wind howled in front of them. To the north, the sky is covered with clouds. Ascending high and looking into the distance, it is clear that there should be a wide open realm, but at this moment, Jiang Xuning felt a kind of suffocation and heaviness like the pressure of an army. She looked at Xie Wei. Xie Wei stood in the wind, his robe hunting, only looking at the clouds that came from the sky. The bottom of the eyes is unusually clear. It was as if the buried dust and haze had been swept away by the cold wind. She heard his calm and faint voice, "Ning Er, it's going to snow." Chapter 197, The Devil Wanders. Jiang Xuning asked, "Do you want to move forward? Maybe they are lucky enough to fight with God and dare to go out before the heavy snow closes the mountain, or maybe the snow is not very heavy and will stop after a short time, which will not affect their itinerary." But Xie Wei shook his head. He looked ahead for a long time, but did not answer, but turned and walked back, down the ridge. Jiang Xuning stood on a high place and stared at his back, like a lonely crane in the reckless mountains. Navigating the impending snowstorm is indeed too risky. It is not safe to find a place to rest temporarily. If the wind and snow are too strong and it rains for a long time, the two of them will be trapped in the city, and they will have to consider whether there is a possibility of freezing to death and starvation. Both can happen. Why did Xie Wei choose the latter? She remembered that Xie Wei didn't like snow. But is that all there is to it? Lightly frowning and standing for a moment, Jiang Xuning finally suppressed his doubts and followed him back the way he came. By this time, the clouds had spread. The light in the mountains and wilderness was not bright, but it was obscured by the drifting haze, and it gradually filled with an oppressive and uneasy atmosphere. The leaves are still. Insects and ants scurried on the surface of the rotting leaves of the dirt as if they had fled. It took them a while to find a cave at the foot of the hill not far behind. There are traces of erosion by the water flow on the rocks, and a few stones have fallen at the entrance of the cave, which have been blown by the wind for a long time, and melt when touched on the outside. It is only 2 feet deep and 1 foot wide. It's not as tall as a foot, and some places are relatively low, and you have to bow your head to pass, which is a bit rugged. When Jiang Xuning cleaned up the rocks and ash in the cave slightly, he found a few handfuls of gray and black fine hairs, like hairs, etc., and estimated that some small animals also came in to take shelter from the rain when the wind and rain were heavy in the past. They're taking up someone's space. But that's fine. When she went outside to find a lot of late autumn dead grass to spread on the ground, she thought that if they came later, they would fall into the net and fall into her and Xie Wei's wombs, and they would not have to find anything to eat by themselves. The snow may stop after a while, or it may not stop for a long time, and in either case, they are afraid of the cold and hunger. So after Jiang Xuning finished the cave, she collected branches and firewood everywhere. And Xie Wei took his bow and arrows and went to the deep mountains and dense forests. It wasn't until it was dark that Jiang Xuning saw him coming out of the col opposite. In his hand he carried a plucked pheasant, a peeled hare, and on the other side was a roe deer, which was not particularly large, all worn on bamboo poles. His face was cold, and even his robe was stained with a lot of blood. Jiang Xuning's eyelids couldn't help jumping. Thanks to Xie Wei's good archery skills these days, he can hunt some wild things in the mountains to satisfy his stomach. But he was a person who loved cleanliness, and he knew that she could not see blood, so after hunting wild things, he usually dealt with them on the spot, neither letting her see them, nor getting any blood on her body. And for now, she vaguely felt that something was wrong, and she was deeply shocked. Xie Wei didn't react to the slightest superfluous reaction to the blood stains on his body, and indifferently inserted the bamboo pole dressed in wild animals into the rock crevice, and then went out again, broke a few clusters of leafy branches, and piled them at the entrance of the cave, which was like half of the wall that was not particularly thick, blocking some of the wind and snow coming in from outside. Then sit down and light a fire. The whole process, not a word was spoken. Jiang Xuning suddenly felt an incomparable depression. Not from the coming blizzard. Just from the person in front of you. She was silent, but sat down in a clean place across from him, hugged her knees, and examined him silently. Night fell quietly. The wind whistled outside. The light inside the cave became extremely dim. Xie Wei's face was also blurred. But the flint began to flash. His calm and cold silhouette flickered brightly and darkly, illuminated by a sudden flash of light, and then plunged into the darkness after the flash had been extinguished, as if in an endless tug. It wasn't until the spark fell on the dry grass that the orange-red flame slowly burned, and the darkness around him was gradually dispelled, illuminating the front of his whole person, leaving only the shaky shadow on the craggy mountain wall behind him. I don't know why. At the moment when the fire finally rose, Jiang Xuning quietly breathed a sigh of relief. Xie Wei looked at her. She avoided this direct gaze, and instead looked out of the cave, and then exclaimed softly, "It's snowing. It's finally snowing." The gloomy sky in the middle of the night was like a dark curtain, torn out by the claws of the wind, and thousands of snowflakes were thrown down, and the wind blew like goose feathers. Some even landed on the branches piled up at the entrance of the cave. Looking at this posture, I'm afraid that it won't take an hour to cover the mountains all over the place. Jiang Xuning looked at it for a while. Her heart was really heavy, but she pretended to laugh easily. "It seems that we are trapped here and can't get out for the time being." She thought that Xie Wei should also turn his head to look at the snow at this time. However, when she turned her head, Xie Wei's gaze still fell on her, silent and silent, like a petal of snow blown into a hole by the wind outside. He didn't even glance outside, but only after seeing the reluctant smile on the corner of Jiang Xuning's lips gradually fade stiffly, he lowered his eyes again and added firewood to the fire. Xie Wei's fingers are very beautiful. It didn't seem to take much effort to break a few branches, and then threw them into the fire. There were leaves that were not dry enough to be licked by the flames, curling up with a tiny crackling sound. Suddenly there was silence in the cave. Jiang Xuning sat opposite him with the fire, and no one said anything to break the silence. Jumping flames, burning deep in the pupils. At this moment, there is a kind of ordinariness in the veins. In this secluded place, no language has any meaning. She and Xie Wei seemed to have a tacit understanding, and there was nothing to talk about or anything to talk about. Occasionally, she added a few sticks of wood to the fire. But the thoughts seemed to fly away, and all the glamorous and painful memories from far and near came one after another. Jiang Xuning buried her face in the crook of her arm, looking at the burning flames, and finally felt the fatigue of the previous busyness coming up, and gradually became a little sleepy. I don't know when I closed my eyes. In a daze, it was as if I heard someone's suppressed cough. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself lying on a pile of soft grass that had been laid out earlier, with a blood-stained robe on his shoulders. And Xie Wei lacked a robe on his body, and he was still sitting facing the fire, holding half a slender branch between his fingers, just looking at the fire motionlessly. Jiang Xuning thought that she was probably too kind. Otherwise, how can you feel that the tip of your nose is slightly sour? Opened her mouth to say something, but looking at Xie Wei's side face illuminated by the fire, she didn't say anything. She just got up, folded the robe, handed it back to him, and said, "Thank you. Aren't you going to sleep for a while?" Xie Wei looked back at her and took the robe, but did not put it back on. Fingertips touched a little warmth on the soft fabric. For a moment, he wanted to ask, "Jiang Xuning, do you believe that there are devils roaming in the world? In a deserted city with no people, in an empty snowy night?" He didn't dare to sleep. Chapter 198, Nightmare. But Xie Wei didn't ask after all, but replied, "I'm not sleeping." Jiang Xuning went to sit down opposite him, bent down and pulled a few branches on the side, and muttered, "I've been asleep for a while. I have watched the fire. Look at the posture of the snow. Can't stop for a while. Even if you are not sleepy, Mr. will go and rest for a while. In this kind of weather, the more you don't rest, the more likely you are to get sick, and you're going to collapse. Isn't it me who is in trouble?" That's an awkward thing to say. It's a bit of a shame. She knew it herself, so when she was done, she just buried her head in the fire and didn't look up. Xie Wei chuckled inexplicably, looked at the firewood she added, and reminded lightly, "I can't help but burn. Throw it slowly." Jiang Xuning. She had a heart attack for a moment, and when she raised her eyes, she saw the faint smile on Xie Wei's lips, and when it reached her mouth, "Do you still need to remind her?" She swallowed it back, and hummed softly, "I know, sleep with yours." Xie Wei stared at her for a long time, but slowly closed his eyes. He didn't go to lie down on the haystack. He just copied his hand, tilted his head slightly, and leaned against the rock wall behind him to pretend to sleep. Xiewei didn't want to fall asleep. But such a night is not destined to be peaceful. Almost as soon as he closed his eyes, the endless bloody torrent of the old days swept towards him like a nightmare, as if knocking down a cliff with thousands of walls, destroying the towering trees, and enveloping him. Even if you use all your strength, you can't break free. He fell into restless dreams. In the early morning skylight, the glazed tiles of the ninefold palace are stacked one after another, majestic and magnificent. The new snow is white, and the faces of the people who welcome the palace are stained with joy. The young woman stopped, straightened his sleeves, and said to him with a soft smile, "Rugzhu is a good year. It snowed this winter, and the people were even happier when the next year's crops were good. That face should be beautiful and bright." But no matter how hard he tried, he only remembered some vague details, piecing together a small outline. Only the temperature of the palm that led him forward was deeply imprinted. Step by step into the palace gate, walk through the long road, go up the steps, and bow down with her. People in fancy costumes mingled and talked happily. The Crown Prince Shenlang brought in with the rest of his companions and dragged him to play chess with His Royal Highness. After a few games, he fell asleep. And the young woman came, and the man of the palace took her, and went into the warm chamber and slept there. He had a dream. "I dreamed that in the summer, the newly planted cherry tree in my uncle's house bore bright red fruit. I dreamed that I was sitting under the eaves and playing the piano, and the tunes that I couldn't play well suddenly became smoother. I dreamed that the cook in the house finally made a plate of particularly delicious peach cakes, and he laughed and was about to run outside. Then he stumbled and suddenly woke up. When I opened my eyes, it was already dark outside, and there was not a single palace person waiting in the warm pavilion. Only a low cry came in. He got up from the couch, walked out, and saw several young palace people hugging each other, crying and choking. The young woman sat very close to the woman with the phoenix crown and the magnificent palace dress, and her face could not hide her sorrow, but when she saw him, she still smiled and beckoned him to come. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing," she said, "we'll be fine." The young children, although they don't know enough things, can also faintly smell the fear floating in the air. It's just that no one dares to say it. In the middle of the night, a general guarding the palace gate that he had seen before rushed in, wearing bloody armor, knelt down and kowtowed to the queen and cried, "The capital will be broken, please open a secret passage, enter the underground palace, and protect your highness." So they were blindfolded. In the darkness, only the woman held his hand tightly. By the time the blindfold was undone, they had reached a dark room underground, and they could faintly hear the sound of heavy footsteps overhead, and the sound of swords clashing, for almost 2 full days and nights. He could hear it before he fell asleep. When I woke up, I could still hear when I opened my eyes. It wasn't until the 3rd day that the sound faded and I couldn't hear it. The people hiding in the dark room were already much haggard, and almost cried with joy. But the queen rebuked them so that they should not weep. The young woman took him in her arms, and said, "My uncle and father, both great generals, with 100,000 soldiers, will soon receive the news and rush back to take them out of here." When he heard this, he was always puzzled in his heart, what if they couldn't come back? But looking at the queen's aunt's gloomy face, she didn't say anything at all. Time is lost in waiting. Later, I couldn't tell the time, day and night, and just listened to them with my eyes open, or closed my eyes and started a haunting nightmare. But that day, he rarely didn't fall asleep. I vaguely heard as if someone had gone out to investigate. Soon after he returned, there was a sharp voice, something shattering, followed by a crying quarrel, one of which was very familiar. He walked out quietly without shoes. The beaded curtain obscured his figure. The closer you get, the more you hear it. Niang Niang, the heavenly sect and the king of Pingnan are menacing, originally from the ambition of the wolf, killing madness. If there is no trace of His Royal Highness the Prince, the 300 children may still be saved, and they may be able to survive until the reinforcements come to rescue. If according to what you say, no matter who goes, the 300 children are afraid that they will be more than lucky. Yes, they will kill them to prevent future troubles. If it is false, it may not be annoyed and angry. How can Li Dai Tao stiff? The rebel party has already issued an ultimatum to the whole capital. If no one shows up again, won't it provoke a popular uprising? At that time, even if the rebel party is expelled and the rebellion is quelled, how do you know that it will not cause turmoil in the government and the opposition and clear the stream of criticism? But Niang Niang, he hasn't even his 7-year-old birthday. How old is the prince? Do you dare to send my son to death? Then why should it be my child? Just because my son is a king, he is a minister. The minister dies for the king. There is a difference between dignity and inferiority, and there is no difference between high and low. With Shen Lang being a king, he is a minister. There is a difference between dignity and inferiority, and there is no difference between high and low. Ministers should die for the king. He stood quietly behind the beaded curtain, and saw the young woman weeping dry of her tears, and sitting down on the ground with tears of blood, covering her face. The cold woman said, "Go and invite Xiao Shiza to come." The eunuch on the side bowed down, walked over, and opened the beaded curtain, and when he saw him standing behind the curtain, he screamed in fright, fell to the ground, and shouted in a trembling voice like a ghost, "Shiza, why are you here?" Empress Xiao, who was wearing a phoenix crown, stiffened for a moment, and the anger on her face had not yet calmed down, but when she turned her head to see him, she quickly changed to her usual closeness and gentleness, and smiled at him. "What, can't you sleep? It just so happens that my aunt has something to discuss with you." He stood there and didn't walk over. Empress Yao walked over and squatted in front of him. "The sage is a scholar, you should be a loyal monarch. Now there are bad people outside who want to arrest His Royal Highness the Prince. You are His Royal Highness's companion. Would you like to pretend to be His Royal Highness the Crown Prince and go out?" He looked up into the corner. Shen Langs, who was about the same age, sat there with a curled face, a little dodging when he touched his gaze, but in an instant, he glared back at him viciously, and suddenly got up and reprimanded, "The king wants his ministers to die, do you dare not go?" Empress Yao was annoyed and scolded him, "Shut up." When he turned back to him, he was kind and pleasant. "This palace knows that the prince has been wise since he was a child, and he is the most sensible, and he should know the trade-offs." The weeping woman finally broke down and rushed to the side, wailing, "No, don't go." Empress Yao waved her hand. The eunuchs who were standing in the darkness came up and held her down, and stopped her in the distance, and he only felt as if they had grown up in the darkness, and when they came out, they seemed to have been bloodied out of the darkness, but they were silent like walking corpses. Empress Yao's enamel armor-clad fingers lightly rested on his shoulder, turned back to him and pointed at the woman, and said with a smile, "Look, your mother is hiding here these days, and she is going to suffocate and go crazy. She loves you, and you protect her, right?" The guard had a sword in his hand. I don't know when it was out of its sheath, and it shone with a miserable white cold light in the darkness. They restrained the weak woman. She couldn't make a sound, couldn't move, only a sad whimper. Her tearful eyes seemed to be pleading. He blinked, slowly withdrew his gaze, seemed to have an extraordinary calm, and replied, on behalf of your highness, and on behalf of your highness, and on behalf of your minister." The woman closest to him smiled with satisfaction. The woman who was furthest away from him hid her face and wept. He walked over. Someone stopped. Empress Yao looked at him for a long time, waved her hand, and those people retreated. He came to the beautiful woman, embraced her, and whispered, "Mother, don't be afraid." But she cried even harder, holding him and refusing to let go. Until someone forcefully breaks it open. He saw them pull her down and put her aside, and heard Empress Yao say behind his back, "And will take good care of her." A eunuch took off the clothes Shen Lang was wearing and put them on for him. From shoes and socks, to jade pendants. Before he was blindfolded again, he knelt down and quietly kowtowed to the woman, who struggled like crazy, but could not break it out anyway. The darkness seemed to become a bottomless abyss at this moment. He walked and groped in it. After hearing the sound of a mechanism and the opening of the dark tunnel, a chill came over his face. Took off the blindfolded silk cloth, walked out of the dankai of the Qianqing Palace, and went down the steps one by one. The corpses of the palace people were all over the ground, in the cracks of the stones, in the low-lying places, and the frozen blood was like red amber. It's still snowing. He didn't know if the snow had been falling since the day he entered the palace, and it hadn't stopped, or if it had stopped and it was snowing new in the middle. I just feel very cold, and my fingers hurt from the cold. Dreams fall between walks. The dark night and the white snow all turned into terrible ghosts, shouting at him hoarsely. Suddenly, countless unfamiliar faces overlapped in front of me. Gloomy, hideous, and cold. Someone asked, "Are you Shen Lang?" And he said, "I am." Then I heard the long knife unsheathed, the snow sword clanged, and a cold sneer, "Kill! Kill!" Suddenly obscured by the incoming wind and snow in front of him, he walked in a river with difficulty. The sound of a cat could be heard in the snow and mist. He rushed in and shouted, "Where are you?" No one responded. He tripped over a stone under his feet and fell to the ground, but when he got up, he found that his hands were all red. It was not a river under his feet, but countless endless blood, and it was not a stone that stumbled on his feet, but a small arm. Fear gripped him at that moment. He took a step back. But the wind swept in at this time, sweeping away all the obstructions that obscured the view, revealing the hill of countless children's corpses. The broken limbs pressed against the cold and hard body, the severed throat and the smashed head. A few cats squatted on it, burying their heads in something. They were dirty, skinny as skin, and seemed to have no flesh, and it appeared that one of their heads had these strange edges, and when they turned their heads to look at him, the bones of their ribs protruding from the thin fur. Hungry eyes, glowing in the dark. Even the screams reveal a low and eerie horror, which makes people almost sick. Meow. A cry full of sharp hostility. The shadow swooped down on him like lightning. Mothers. Xie Wei woke up suddenly, the tips of his fingers trembled, and when he opened his eyes, the fire of the fire was still burning, but he could hardly feel half a minute of temperature, and even because of the surging nausea, it was difficult to move. But when he turned his head, he saw the mouth of the cave. A pair of eyes that glow in the darkness. It was a dozen wild cats in the mountains, gathered at the entrance of the cave at some point, and their figures emerged from the branches and leaves piled up at the entrance of the cave, looking at them with fierce eyes. Almost at the same time, the bobcat at the front bared its teeth viciously. A scream came out of its mouth, and it suddenly turned into a black shadow and quickly rushed towards the cave. Zhang Xuning added firewood in the middle of the night, and when she saw that it was going to be done in the second half of the night, she was still sleepy, and she nodded her head and took a nap. Xie Wei vaguely said something in her dream, which made her wake up suddenly. At this time, I happened to see a group of bobcats gathered at the entrance of the cave with hunched backs and hair, and suddenly I was terrified, and a cold air rushed from the soles of my feet down my spine to the back of my head. Xie Wei's short knife wiped clean the rocks resting beside him. In the midst of the lightning and fire, there was no time to think about it. Zhang Xuning picked up the knife, and at the moment when the lynx pounced, he stood in front of Siewei and slashed towards the cat. There is no rule at all. SHH. There seemed to be a cracking sound in the snowy night, but the sharp blade cut through the cat's eyes, opened half of the belly, and the dirty blood suddenly splashed on her, and the cat fell down, fell to the ground, and screamed miserably. Jiang Xuning just acted subconsciously. She didn't expect to see blood, let alone see such a bloody and terrifying scene. Her scalp exploded, and she almost wanted to bury her head and vomit. At that moment, she wanted to throw away the knife in her hand. I almost stepped back. However, there are old images emerging in the dark. A voice told her that she couldn't retreat. Then the force drove her to renew her grip on the knife. Forcing himself not to look down, he resisted the urge to gag, and only quickly kicked out the bobcat corpse that had lost its voice on the ground. The bobcat outside the cave suddenly screamed again. Siewei was extremely cold, his face was pale, he couldn't see her expression, he couldn't read her mood, he could only see this back, panting and rising and falling with extreme fear. Distinctly trembling fingers, clutching the knife tightly. Jiang Xuning acted like a fool, stubbornly blocked him behind him, and said to him in a low voice that was almost inaudible, "Sir, I am here." Chapter 199, Who Can Cross the Sea of Suffering? The carcass of the bobcat at the front rubbed against the branches piled up at the entrance of the cave, and rolled into the group of bobcats outside, causing the glowing brutes to stir up and bared their teeth when they sensed the danger. But it's still snowing outside. It's hard to find a warm place to avoid the snow, and no one is willing to leave, only moving silently, as if looking for an opportunity to enter. The wild cats in the mountains are no better than the domesticated domestic cats, each with sharp claws and fangs, and the gloomy posture as they wander back and forth at the mouth of the cave is simply chilling and creepy. But what happened to them also made them jealous. Jiang Xuning confronted them, fine cold sweat was already oozing from her back, and after standing for a while, her calves and stomach trembled because of excessive tightness. No. A stalemate is no way out. She had to get rid of the brutes. Deep in the mountains and forests, inaccessible. According to the pawns of the foot peddlers in the market, wild beasts are afraid of fire. Jiang Xuning clasped the knife between her fingers tightly, but her eyes quietly looked away, looked at the fire that was still burning in the cave, and then gritted her teeth, and quickly pulled a burning wooden stick from it, and swung it straight towards the wildcats surrounding the entrance of the cave. The scorching temperature is approaching in an instant. Almost all of the wildcats arched their backs the moment she stepped forward and spread out to the side. But there were also a few who could not dodge, and were picked up by the burning flames, and burned to the skin by the red-hot sticks, and suddenly screamed sharply, and fled far away. How can a few cats fight a human? After eating pain, no matter how fierce he was, he didn't dare to take a step forward. Jiang Xuning even held a fire stick to drive away. They had retreated outside, the wind was blowing, the snow was freezing, and finally they knew that they could not enter the cave, and they cried out a few times in reluctance, and slowly dispersed. In the blink of an eye, there was no trace of the snow on the ground, and it was time to find another shelter from the wind and snow. After the thrill, it finally calmed down. Jiang Xuning gasped violently and wanted to walk back, but for some reason she stood there, but she couldn't take a step, as if her whole person was nailed to the ground. Until a hand suddenly grabbed her arm and dragged her over. Siewei's chest seemed to burn with a fire. She grabbed the back of her head with one hand, pressed her into her arms, buried her head and kissed deeply, licked her lips, pried open her teeth, invaded like a hot fire, and tightened out a blood-pumping depression and cruelty. Jiang Xuning's head went blank. Siewei was like a beast, gnawing at her, and murmured, "I'm so bad, why are you so soft-hearted?" Before her mind could return to her cage, when she was awakened by this powerful incursion, She had become a prey bound by his arms, unable to break free, trapped in chaos. Previously, Siawei was sitting by the fire, and there was a layer of warm residual heat on his lips and fingers, but when he pressed closer, Jiang Xuning felt that this temperature did not go deeper, because from the depths of his body, only a cold feeling slowly came out. The kiss is clear and fiery, but it makes people tremble. He clung to her skin, soaking up her warmth. He snatched the stick of fire in his hand and threw it down, but the knife was still between his fingers. Was so nervous that Jiang Xuning forgot to put it down. It seems that holding on tightly like this is the only way to be safe. Siawei's fingers went down her wrist, little by little, breaking her curled, almost spasmodic fingers, and slashing the knife out hard. But she clutched it too tightly. There was a red mark on the palm of his hand. Siawei's kiss became a little lighter, a little softer, and his deep pupils looked at her, and he coaxed softly, "It's okay, give me the knife." Tears rolled down without warning. Jiang Xuning trembled. He finally pulled the short knife out of her finger and threw it on the ground, holding her black hair, letting her forehead hang down against his chest. With the aftermath of collapse, his thin shoulders shrugged slightly, and cried in a low voice. Siawei stood quietly, blinked, and suddenly thought, if you are trapped in the mountains forever and don't go out, it will be good. Yet almost as soon as the thought came to him, another voice shouted hysterically at him. How dare you? How dare you? You have such a bad fate, ups and downs, you have to be strong for half your life, you don't even have the qualifications to sleep, and the blood and hatred have not yet been avenged. How dare you have such a thought? No matter how bold Jiang Xuning is, it is just a point of intrigue with people in the palace and noisy quarrels with people in the market, but such a strange and terrifying thing as a lynx night howling has never been encountered. When she calmed down, she realized that she was scared to death. After crying for a while, he pushed Siawei away, and sat back on the fire to add firewood, and he didn't stop smoking. There is an indescribable comic aspect of this scene. Siawei laughed slowly. When Jiang Xuning saw it, she raised a branch in her hand and hit the ground, and said to him fiercely, "What are you laughing at? Are people like you who are even afraid of cats qualified to laugh? If it weren't for my aunt and grandmother, you would have been torn clean by them." Siawei felt that she was a childish temper and did not refute it. Just pick up the branch she had broken and throw it into the fire. Jiang Xuning wiped her face, remembered that she felt wrong just now, shed tears for a while, and cried until it was done outside, only to feel that her abdomen was shriveled, so she simply pulled out the bamboo pole wearing the hair, and handed it to Siawei, and said angrily, "I'm hungry. It's always been a matter of Thanksgiving to eating." He didn't say anything, he took it. The two roasted a rabbit. Jiang Xuning ate a lot as if venting her anger, but Siawei didn't seem to have much appetite, and put it down after eating 2 pieces of meat. The snow outside seemed to be much lighter, except for some snow foam. The mountains are all white. There were no birds to be seen, and there were not many animals to be seen. After eating, Jiang Xuning frowned, took a branch on the ground and counted how long their food could be eaten, how long the firewood could be burned, recalled what was the situation in Tatar for a while, and thought of Shenzai's matter in the blink of an eye. The branches that were scratching on the ground suddenly stopped. She turned her head to look at Siawei, hesitated for a moment and asked, "Earlier, you said that Yan Lin had already rushed to the border first, and wanted to save His Highness. But what kind of method is it? Will it affect us if we delay halfway?" Siawei sat there, as if he was out of his mind, and did not answer. Jiang Xuning wanted to repeat her question, but when she got up to walk towards Siawei, who was sitting upright, she suddenly felt that something was wrong. A flash of thought flashed in her mind, and then she looked at Siawei, and she realized. He sat there watching the snow. The white snow gives people a sense of emptiness and loneliness, and the sky is falling and being reflected by the snow, all of which are under his eyes. Siawei was as silent as a statue. Jiang Xuning suddenly felt uneasy for no reason, even worse than the previous confrontation with the wildcat, and she called, "Sir." Siawei didn't reply. "It doesn't have much impact." But Jiang Xuning didn't care about the answer to the question at this time. She just remembered the terrible guess revealed by Yu Fangyan in her previous life, and looked at Siawei's posture that was still looking outside, and there was already a trace of imperceptible fear in her voice. "Siawei." Siawei asked her, "What's wrong?" She was just scared, so she stepped forward and pulled him straight away, preventing him from looking out again. "Don't look at it." Siawei looked at her, a distant light and shadow drifted in his eyes, but asked, "Do you know anything?" Jiang Xuning's heart beat like a drum. No what?" Siawei smiled and said, "I don't know. What are you afraid of?" Jiang Xuning forced her composure. "I'm not afraid." Siawei stretched out his hand, followed her chin, and slowly put it on the side of her neck, his slightly cool palm pressed against her clear skin, sensing the surging blood, and said flatly, "Lie." Jiang Xuning was shocked, waved his hand away, pressed his slightly open neckline tightly, and retreated back, even with a little anger, and said inwardly, "You are sick." Siawei was speechless. He really didn't look at the snow again, just rested lightly against the cave wall. At first, Jiang Xuning didn't notice anything unusual. The next day, she found that the suppressed cough that had occasionally sounded in her dreams was not a dream. Siawei began to cough. In such cold weather, his face turned pale at a rate that was recognizable to the naked eye. On the third day, he charred a small half of the roe deer meat. Also on this day, after she put the snow in the water bladder and melted it, she handed it to Siawei, but he didn't catch it accurately, and paused for a while before taking it in his hand. At that moment, Jiang Xuning felt a cold air drilling into the cracks of her bones. Siawei's eyes really didn't see anything abnormal, so he slowly took a sip of water and said to her, "Now I'm useless. If I were you, smart enough, I should take my things with me, and look for the day when the snow stops, and go far." Jiang Xuning thought, "Why is this person like this?" She didn't dare to reveal the slightest excess emotion, but said, "Do you want to die here?" Siawei coughed again, the smile on his lips spread slightly, and said, "What's wrong with dying here? At least it's better than being a bargaining chip in the hands of people. Life is up to you, death is up to you." Jiang Xuning suddenly felt like she was in a dream. Looking at the calm and ordinary person in front of her, she felt a great sadness surging up and filling her. This is Siawei that she has never seen in her 2 lifetimes. But how so? How could Siawei be like this? She took a step back, her chest pressing like a huge stone, and she couldn't breathe. So he turned around and went straight out of the cave. As soon as the cold wind blew outside, the breath gradually eased. Siawei sat there without moving from beginning to end, slowly plugging the plug of the water bladder and gently leaning it aside. He thought it would be nice if she was really gone. But after a while, the footsteps approached again, and when she entered the cave, she said coldly, "The snow has stopped outside, and the sun is out, and the weather will soon be warm, and we will soon be able to set off." Siawei smiled almost imperceptibly. How could he believe her? The snow is not cold, but the snow is cold. If the sun really comes out and the snow is piled up all over the mountain, the following days will be sad. Jiang Xuning didn't mention it at all, as if she had never heard Siawei's words. From this day on, it was up to her to bake and eat. It's just that sometimes it's too hot, sometimes it's not enough, and it always takes several tosses to eat smoothly in your mouth. Siawei didn't complain. But perhaps there is no strength to complain. His cough became more and more severe as the weather became colder and colder, and at the end he burned a little, and as soon as he closed his eyes, demons and monsters were rampant, and ghosts were in charge. For a while, it was the innocent and frightened eyes of the children who were imprisoned together, and at the same time, it was the sword of King Pingnan and the rebels of the heavenly sect. The demonic face was distorted by anger. They tied him to the walls of the city and put their swords to his neck, intending to threaten the retreating troops with his life. Then there are thousands of troops, mountains of corpses and a sea of blood. Someone was crying out to him in the dark. So he walked that way. But another hand reached out from the void, and grabbed him so hard that every step he took felt like stepping on the tip of a knife, boiling in a pot of oil, and he wanted to cry out loud. "Help me!" But there is no voice of him in heaven and earth. He was like a wandering spirit, struggling out of his devastated body against a shell that would eventually be destroyed, but he hid in the dark with that breath. A voice came anxiously from the depths of the vast fog, shouting to him, "Live, live, live." Another voice hid in the darkness and laughed strangely, "You should have died a long time ago. Why don't you die yet? Why don't you die yet? Why don't you die yet?" The devil wandered through the nightmare, growing out of the depths of his shell, like a great net bound his soul. He had no sword, no sword. No one could hear him either. It wasn't until in this situation where he couldn't see or hear anything, that a Binkinkin's hand lightly rested on his wrist. Siawei felt it tremble, and finally escaped from the depressed dream. "Tightly, hold this hand." Jiang Xuning originally wanted to probe his pulse, seeing that he was already drowsy, and he couldn't distinguish between day and night. How could he suddenly have such a change? His fingers were so hard that it hurt to scratch her, so he struggled a little harder. However, he held it tighter. "Where are you going?" The hoarse voice was extremely low, and it made people's hearts beat when they heard it. "It's late at night." Even if the firewood they picked up was saved and burned, there would not be a few left. The flames on the fire were dim. Even their silhouettes are not clear. That uneasiness once again surfaced from the bottom of Jiang Xunning's heart. She could feel his eyes lock on herself, but said calmly, "I'm not going anywhere, I'm here." Siawei said, "You are a little liar, and you are a liar." His 5 fingers were deeply wedged into her fingers, and he clasped his 2 hands together, and there was a long dormant madness hidden in the depths of his pupils, which were as calm as the deep sea. He grabbed her by the jaw and kissed her hard, punishingly. "It's a bloody kiss." Biting her lip, rolling the bloody sweetness of that stream of blood deep, forcing the tip of her tongue, with an extreme of release, making her gasp and almost suffocated. Jiang Xuning was frightened by him. Her chest rose and fell in the darkness, and he condescendingly suppressed her, looking down at her. Siawei's thumb rubbed hard against the corners of her broken lips, until he saw a slight pain in her eyes, and then slowly retracted his strength and asked her, "Why do you like Zhang Shat? He doesn't know anything, only I can read you." The hoarse voice is like a fluttering flotsam in spring. But falling into Jiang Xunning's ears caused her to tremble. She finally realized that under the body of the saint, there were years of decay and darkness, that kind of forbearance, and sick paranoia. Siawei pressed her against the rock wall, clinging to the cold. The warm lips ran down the pinna of the ear and fell to the side of the neck. With his other palm, he quietly grabbed her slender neck and covered her fragile throat. "Do you know what I want to do most now?" Jiang Xuning felt something burning fall into her neck socket and flow down. She trembled. Siawei whispered to her ear and said, "I want to kill you." Once, he thought that his heart was an impregnable wall. He slowly tightened his palms, but he didn't turn his head to look at her expression at the moment. The voice was cold to the depths, soaked in despair, and with a kind of bewitchment, but I didn't know whether it was to bewitch her or bewitch myself. "Jiang Xuning, right here, die with me, okay. Jiang Xuning slowly closed her eyes. At that moment, I felt that this person who had scared me for half my life was hateful, pathetic, and even pitiful. She wanted to slap him in the face and sober him up. But tears flowed down her cheeks. His fiery and crazy emotions wrapped her inside, reminding her of those difficult days in the past. Her throat seemed to be blocked by something, and she almost choked up. It's not good, Xiejuan, it's not good at all. I saved you, this life is not yours, it is mine. I haven't promised. Don't be a coward. Don't make me look down on you. Chapter 200, Alive. Xie Wei finally let go of her slowly. The darkness is quiet. Only when no one can see clearly can anyone dare to cut open this normal and shiny shell, revealing something darker than the darkness inside, giving a glimpse of what lies beneath the skin. His hand was still clasped with hers, and his fingers intersected. Jiang Xuning said, "Go sleep for a while." Xie Wei's fingers moved to her wrist little by little, and he felt the shallow scar that no longer had many traces left, and his eyes rubbed slightly. He said, "I thought you weren't unusual." Jiang Xuning stood up and added firewood to the fire that was about to be extinguished, regardless of whether it was enough tomorrow, just looking at the flames that slowly re-elevated, illuminating this dim and cold cave, and his heart gradually returned to calm. She didn't look back. "Do you deserve to die too?" Xie Wei was silent behind her for a long time before he laughed softly. "You're right, I'm not worthy." This night, nothing happened. Xie Wei really fell asleep. "I didn't dream anything." Jiang Xuning guarded the fire and sat all night, until dawn, when the dry wood was burned and slowly extinguished, leaving only a little dark red ember to exude temperature. When he came back to his senses, Xie Wei had already gotten up at some point, sat opposite her, and calmly reminded, "It's baked." Jiang Xuning looked down. Indeed, the roe deer meat forked on the bamboo pole has been burnt, and even has a bad smell. She was excited. The eyes can't see clearly, but the nose is very smart. Xie Wei didn't ask her how she knew, because it was so obvious, and only asked, "Last night, why didn't you agree?" Jiang Xuning sneered, "Promise to die with you." Xie Wei was silent for a long time. His expression was different from last night, but he seemed to be a different person, with long eyebrows and a straight nose, narrow eyes and thin lips, and a kind of vague blankness, without denying it at all. "Why?" "Still ask why? What normal person wants to die?" Jiang Xuning tore off the roasted part vigorously, and wanted to say a few unkind words, but in the end, she still compromised and softened. Because she knew that this person was serious last night. So he said, "I'm afraid of pain." Unexpectedly, Xie Wei continued to ask, "What if it doesn't hurt? How can death not hurt?" Jiang Xuning looked at the piece of burnt meat, was in a trance for a moment, and then looked at Xie Wei again, and replied to him seriously, "You can eat and drink while you are alive, and you can enjoy it in every way. Not only do I want to live, but I also hope to live a little longer, a little longer. Mr. Xie, I have been thinking about your words for 2 years. Life is not free in the world, you are right. I am thinking about His Royal Highness, I am worried about Yanlin, and I miss Fang Yin. So many people need me and like me, and I can't bear to let me die. I will live one day if I can live, and I will be happy if there is not a day, even for an hour." In the past, she thought that Xie Wei was a saint, and later she felt that Xie Wei was a devil. But it's all wrong. Xie Wei is also only a mortal in the flesh, as Lucien said, but this Hong Chen purgatory struggles, and her life is even inferior to her ordinary people. When he said the sentence "only I can read you," Jiang Xuning also read him completely. In the previous life, Yu Fangyin did not guess wrong. "Xie Wei, who has never admitted that identity from beginning to end, is the son of Ding Fei who really bears the blood of Xiao Yan and the two clans, and is favored by God, so he can survive by luck. There is no need to recognize one's ancestors and return to one's ancestors. There is no need for blood kinship. From the moment the royal family and the Xiao family pushed him out of Li Didozhuang, he was Xie Wei, throwing away his old name and surname. There will never be a day of peace, no good night's sleep, only bathed in the cold fire of hatred. In a chaotic world, saints cannot live. Only the devil can use the banner of the hero to wash away the old unwillingness. She has been suffering from the word family all her life, so why not Xie Wei? So if he can understand her, she can understand him. It's just that she knew it too late, and Xie Weixing probably went to Beijing in the same car with her many years ago, and when he learned about her life experience, he had already seen her through. Jiang Xuning felt that the world was really a little wonderful, and after finishing speaking, she remembered those people who had passed through her life. Some of them left her scars, and some of them healed her pain. Such struggles and ups and downs are the only way to live. She suddenly became calm, as if she had come to her senses, and asked him, "How much more can you see?" Xie Wei didn't speak for a long time, or maybe he was thinking about the reluctance in her words. Jiang Xuning tore a piece of good meat and handed it over. Xie Wei didn't answer, but raised his eyes and asked, "Last night I was delirious, dazed, and had Meng Lang's frivolous behavior. You didn't seem to be scared. Don't mind." Scared? There is a little bit. But if you want to mind, she doesn't seem to care that much. The cause and effect of the kiss seems to be more of a strong emotion, but it doesn't carry much desire and lust. Then she looked at him as clearly as she saw herself. He was as tall as a mountain. Jiang Xuning stared at him for a moment, took back the piece of meat he didn't take, took a small bite of himself, and sneered, but it was rare to be solemn. "Xie Juan, you are not sick, you are just crazy." Xie Wei laughed when he heard this. Jiang Xuning couldn't understand the smile again, and didn't bother to think about it anymore, so she only put the bamboo pole with the rest of the meat in her hand to him, took a small piece in her mouth, and got up and walked towards the outside of the cave. The snow has indeed stopped. Even melted a little. But when you walk on the snow and step on the depression, half of your calf can sink into it. Looking at the distant mountains again, overlapping and overlapping, even if there is not much left in the distance, it is difficult for them to go forward in such a situation, and go over the mountains and mountains to Jinan Mansion. But Jiang Xuning looked into the distance, and her gaze fell on the mountain in the distance. In fact, she was watching it yesterday evening. It's just that the light was too dark to see clearly. However, by the time the sky was blazing, everything that had been blurred last night was clear. There wasn't much snow on the southeast side of the mountain. At this time, you can see with the naked eye that the dense woods on the hillside are dark and yellow. Her heart throbbed violently. She took a deep breath, didn't even eat the piece of meat, hurried back to the cave, and said to Xie Wei abruptly, "Let's go back now, go around to the back of this mountain." Xie Wei followed the voice and looked at her. But there was a white expanse behind her, and he could see that he closed his eyes. Jiang Xuning couldn't help but say, she had already begun to pack up some of the things they left in the cave that she could take away, and she spoke quickly, "I just saw that the snow on the mountain in front of me is in the northwest, and there is no snow in the southeast. If the wind and snow come from the northwest, then there will not be a lot of snow on the slopes behind our mountain. We may not be able to get out of trouble, but at least you can see that we will not starve to death." Xie Wei sat still. Jiang Xuning picked up his bow and arrow, took the water bladder, looked at him at the end, and after a moment of hesitation, he took a knife and swiped it on the hem of his clothes, tore off a piece of fine Hangzhou silk, and tied one end to Xie Wei's wrist and the other end to his wrist. He felt familiar, pursed his lips and smiled. I thought you were burned and confused, and you forgot about it. Jiang Xuning snorted lightly. I'd rather not remember. Who wants to remember the bad luck and embarrassment of the past day by day? She said, we are at the foot of the mountain, and it shouldn't take long to walk around the mountain from the west. The road at the foot of the mountain is much smoother than the slope, and I go in front, and you go behind. Xie Wei was dragged up by her. The wrists of the two were tied together, but there was an empty hanging in the middle, and he didn't make a sound, but he stepped forward to hold Jiang Xuning's hand. Jiang Xuning. She turned her head to look at him, intending to say a few words. However, when he looked at him, he saw that when he got up, his sleeve robe was fluttering, but something fell from his sleeve to the place. So he said, you dropped something. Xie Wei looked down. Jiang Xuning thought that he should be called Xie Ban blind at the moment, so she was rarely merciful, and bent down to pick it up for him. It was a 2-inch square paper bag, with a stroke of dancha drawn on the outside, and it seemed to contain some powder inside, which at first glance looked like an origami bag of medicine in a pharmacy. But the folding method is not quite the same. The red mark was even more bizarre, but it gave her a sense of familiarity, as if she had seen it somewhere. Jiang Xuning frowned slightly, handed it back to him, and said, if you are not sick, you can prepare medicine. Xie Wei took the finger of the paper bag and stiffened for a moment. But he didn't show the slightest flaw, and retracted his sleeve casually, saying, heart disease is also a disease. Jiang Xuning didn't think much about it when she heard this, and wanted to break free of his hand, but she felt that the two of them were tied together, and his eyes were not very good, so he didn't let go, but held it back calmly and walked outside the cave. The location of this cave was not high. When they came out of it, they walked to the west, and stepped on the snow that had been piled up 1 foot at a time, and after a short time the cold wind poured in through their robes, and made people shiver, and their shoes and boots went deeper into the snow, and their feet knew how to ache, and gradually they did not even feel anything. Jiang Xuning walked in front with difficulty, inevitably touching the roots of the stone tree, stumbling and stumbling, planting and nibbling on the snow at every turn, and sometimes even Xie Wei would be pulled down by her. She hated her name now. People couldn't stop shivering, their lips were blue, and they joked with Xie Wei, I used to think about it, my name is Jiang Xuning, you probably hate this name, after all, it's nothing good to meet it. Xie Wei said, I don't hate it. Jiang Xuning looked at him, don't go against your heart. Although Xie Wei was useless when it snowed, he didn't know how much better his body bones were than her, and seeing that she couldn't stand, he could still hold her hard, and said, your name is not Jiang Shui. Churning. The snow at the end of winter, when it meets the wind of early spring, has stopped, quieted, and melted. Why not? Jiang Xuning pondered for a while, gasped and stood firm, continued to walk forward, and only said, then I should be your savior. Yes, I saved you both times. If you don't have me, you have virtue. The danger of the previous life came to mind. Her footsteps stopped abruptly, and the scene when she went to great lengths to find Xie Wei after the palace change in her previous life was suddenly magnified to the limit, and it was fixed on the lacquer plate of several delicate small bowls held in the corners of the imperial case. At that time, there was a piece of paper with a red stroke on the plate. She finally remembered where it was familiar. There is always something like this in the palace. But she would never associate this thing with Xie Wei. Seeing that she wasn't leaving, Xie Wei also stopped. How am I? Jiang Xuning turned around slowly, looked at him with a disappointed and sad gaze, and clenched her teeth, afraid that she would be shivering from the cold at the moment. She reached out to him, give it to me. Xie Wei asked, what? Jiang Xuning finally couldn't help it, the corners of her eyes were slightly red, and she said to him loudly, "Wushizan, give it to me." Xie didn't know how she could have guessed. He blinked slightly. "Ning there is a saying, I wanted to say it to you a long time ago." Zhang Xuning looked at him with wide eyes, still holding out her hand. Xie sighed helplessly, and at this moment, he raised his hand and landed on her neck, knocking her unconscious, before he said like smoke, "The things you bake are really hard to eat?" She could scarcely believe what he had done. After shaking in front of his eyes for a few moments, he fell softly. Xie reached out in time to catch her, looked at the white expanse around her, and thought, last time she was a lame doctor, and he couldn't smell blood for half a year after he returned to the capital. The delicate little girl is really not very good. 5 stones scattered with him. It's hard to say that there is no idea of giving it a try. But he hasn't really tasted it yet. Ning Er's worried posture really looked like he was about to turn his face with him immediately. "Are you still on the road, and you don't have a priority?" Xie flipped his fingers, and the paper bag containing the powder turned around between his fingers. He was still chilling in the end. Glanced at Zhang Xuning in her arms, and took a look, but she didn't care about this thing as much as before. He only opened his mouth to bite the corner of the paper bag, and even the medicine was scattered on the paper, and he ate it together. After staying for a while, there is a bit of warmth, even heat, pouring out from the limbs, making people feel that the wind and snow around them seem to have decreased. Xie bent his lips and smiled, lowered his head and gently kissed her slightly frowning eyebrows, and then carefully carried the person on his back and walked forward.